G'day, this is the second video in this series of plotting from C++ using Python. In this video we'll go over the code, just the basics of what you would need to take from the code to actually implement in your own code. I won't get into the details of how the functions are actually working, that will be in the next video, so let's get into it. Okay, so here we are in Visual Studio Code, and before I get into actually showing you guys the code, I'll just kind of briefly walk you through what's going on with the file system that I've got set up here. So I have my CPP file that's kind of just hanging out outside, but then within the directory, within this working directory, this workspace, I have this debug folder. Okay, so if I open this up and have a look at what's in here, I got three other folders that are also in here. Now the reason that this is here is just to kind of maintain some cleanness across all the outputs that that the CPP file and the Python is going to output. You don't have to have this set up if you don't want to, but that would mean if you didn't want to do it this way, you would have to go in and change parts of the C++ code and the Python code to actually output all the things it needs to output and read in the things that it needs to read in. You'd have to call them correctly. So you can kind of see here this first folder at the top here, this output data. There's nothing in this, neither is there in output ports because I haven't run the code yet, but you can kind of guess what's going to go in here, right? It's the output data that the CPP file is going to output, and then that data is going to get read in by the Python scripts. The output plots, that's actually where the plots are going to be stored, okay? So if you call this plotting function that's in C++ that I've made, that's in this C++ file, it will actually save the plots to this directory, this output directory. So if you've got a lot of plots that you've output, right, you kind of want to keep all that, you kind of want to keep your workspace a little bit clean. That's why I've kind of got this folder here that's just saving the outputs and obviously saving the data into different folders. And then the last folder down here, this is the plotting scripts. So as I said, this is where you're utilizing Python, but you don't have to utilize Python. You could use MATLAB or NuPlot or any kind of plotting script. Essentially, you would, if you wanted to use those other languages, you kind of put those plotting scripts in here, okay? I'm not going to get too much into what's going on in these plotting scripts, but if I just click on this one, this plot2dtext.py, and we have a look at this, right? This is kind of very general Python stuff, okay? We've got that we're reading in the data, right? That's what these lines are here. We've got some stuff here that's kind of filling in arrays and things like that, just some miscellaneous things that you have to do for Python. And then we've actually got the plotting here. So if you wanted to format your plots, put titles, put X labels, anything like that, you would come into this Python, you'd come into the Python script or the MATLAB script or the NuPlot script and actually edit it in here, okay? C++ isn't going to do any of that for you. And then these final lines here, this is just saving the actual plots that Python has generated. So now that we've looked at that, let's switch over to the C++ script. Okay, so here we are in the C++ script. I've got some comments at the top that's just kind of briefly explaining what this code is actually doing. And then I've also got the what you need to put in terminal to actually compile and then also to run the code. I've got some very generic headers that are at the top here. And then I have my function declarations. Okay, so these are all the functions that are utilized in the script or that are held within the script. If you don't want to really understand what's going on in those functions, that's totally fine. But if you do, then watch the following video after this. And then I have my main script. So the main script is where everything's kind of going on and is the part that you would need to understand to actually take what's in this code and implement it in your own code. So at the very start, I declare some integers, right, that I kind of need for my arrays. So all this code is doing, all this main function is doing, it's just basically making some really simple arrays, a matrix that I'm filling in as well, and then it's going to plot the arrays and it's going to plot the matrix. So these first couple of lines, right, I'm declaring some arrays. If you're familiar with Python and you're familiar with MATLAB, you would recognize this linspace function that just generates arrays. So that's all that's doing. It's just my own function that I've written. You're more than welcome to take it. And then down here, I'm making a mesh grid as well. If you're familiar with Python and MATLAB, this mesh grid is kind of useful if we're wanting to make a matrix and fill it in with something, which is what we're doing in this following line here. We're just filling in this Z matrix through a sign function. Okay, so all that's in this Z matrix is just the values that are coming out from this sign function across all of it. Now notice I'm not using vector, I'm actually just using array. So all of these plotting functions that I have written here, they work for pointers that are pointing to arrays. So keep that in mind. If you're using vectors, you'll have to modify some of the code to actually get it to work. But if you're in C++ and you're doing numerics, generally you should be using arrays and not so much vector. Okay, so now the important part, or the part that's kind of doing, the work, is just these functions here. Okay, these two here. All that I've done is I've declared a string here that is essentially going to label each one of the plots. This is kind of important. When you actually generate the plots, you kind of want to name the files something that makes sense. So because all I've passed here is the array X and array Y into this plotting function, I know that it's just going to plot a linear line. So that's why I've got linear line. And then text here is just to indicate that it's a text file system and not some other file system. It's not important. You don't have to write text there, but that's fine. So all that I have to pass into this function here is the size of the array, right? So that's the nx, that's how long the array is. The two arrays that I want to plot, and then obviously that file name, okay? So if I want to plot X and Y, if you have two arrays and you want to plot X and Y, all you would need to do is just pass them in this fashion to this function, and it will generate a 2D plot of X and Y arrays. Just like what you would do in MATLAB or Python, if you had arrays in there, you can just pass it to this plot function that's in those languages. And then the line down here, it's doing pretty much the same thing, but we're doing a 3D plot. Okay, so we're plotting a matrix out. So this would be similar to like IMShow in Python or ImageSC in MATLAB. So all that I pass in here to this function is the dimension, right? The size of the X dimension, the actual X dimension, that matrix that I made up here in mesh grid that's containing all of the X's, the Y dimension, right? How long is the Y dimension along? The actual Y grid that I've made in that mesh grid function again, and then the matrix that I want to plot out. That's that Z, right? That's the one that I filled in here with this sign function. And then obviously that name that I want the file to save as. Okay, so in this case it's matrix text. That's what the actual plotted file will save as. That's what the name will come under. Okay, so I'll just show you guys what it outputs and how to run it. So I'll come up here, grab my line to compile, down in terminal. So I'll compile the code. Now I'll run the code. And if we watch up here, we should see these files get generated. So we've got the data files, right? I've got my linear line text, matrix text, and then Python gets called and the Python plots get generated in here. So if I actually click on these text files, you can see all the data's in here, right? Those first two, the first row here, this is actually specifying the dimensionality, right? How long these rows are. So keep that in mind if you're using another plotting language. The way that I'm generating the way that I'm generating the files is that those first two elements are actually saying how long things are, and then the same for the matrix one, right? So I got 1,000, 1,000. That's the dimensionality of X and Y. Therefore, the dimensionality of the Z is going to be that time, like 1,000 times 1,000, which is 1,000,000. So now if I come and have a look at the plot outputs, you can see that linear line text, it's just a linear line that was plotting that X array and that Y array. And then the matrix plot is obviously this three-dimensional sign function here that I can see. So again, if I wanted to add titles or X labels, right, in these plots, I would have to go into those Python scripts, right, that plot 2D text or plot 3D text, and I'd have to change those. I'd have to add to those in there. Okay, so in short, if you want to use what's in this code and implement it in your own code, all you would need to do is just take these function declarations and the include files that are above the main here. If you don't want to output to binary, you can ignore these declarations here, and all you would essentially need are these text save and plot 2D and text save plot 3D and the system command call function. Again, if you don't want the linspace and mesh grid, that's totally fine. You don't need them. To do the plotting, all you really need are these three functions here. So you would put all this above your main, and then below the main, you would actually have the definitions of the functions. So you can kind of see down below here, I actually have what these functions are doing that I haven't gone into in this video. Now, keep in mind that you also need to have the debug folder with all the subfolders within it, so that the paths and everything are correct for when these plotting functions get called and are utilizing those Python scripts. So in the next video, I'll actually go through and explain how these functions are working, and then also have a look at the differences between times of outputting to a binary file and outputting to a text file. Thanks.